Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, and to some of you, especially on the West Coast, good morning, and welcome to our webinar. My name is Macy Morin. I'm a program coordinator with the National Association of Regional Councils, and we're excited to be bringing you this regional broadband planning webinar in partnership with our friends over at BroadbandUSA. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few quick housekeeping items. If you are experiencing any technical issues, feel free to email me. My email is on the screen. We are hoping to have a few minutes at the end for question and answers. You could submit a question at any time during our presentation by typing it into the questions box at the right side of your screen. A link to the webinar recording will be sent to each of you tomorrow in a follow-up email. And you can also download the PowerPoint slides right now from the handout section, also on the right-hand side of your screen. And slide transition may be a little slow at times, approximately 5 to 20 seconds, so please be patient as the slide is moving through. And with that, we'll get started. So today's agenda, we'll start out with Amy Singh and Jean Rice from BroadbandUSA. They'll be sharing with us steps regional councils can take to develop their own community broadband map, which will help you create a strategy and action plan to achieve your broadband vision. Then we'll have Miriam Gillow-Wiles from the Southwest Colorado Council of Governments and Kevin Berg from the New River Valley Regional Commission. They'll be sharing their experiences with regional broadband planning and how it's helping spur broadband deployment in Colorado and Virginia, respectively. And with that, I will turn it over to Amy and Jean. Are you guys there?
Yes, thank you so much, Macy. So this is Jean Rice from the National Telecommunications and Information Administration and part of BroadbandUSA. Myself and my colleague Amy Sung are really happy to join this webinar on planning for community broadband roadmap. And I have to say I am especially pleased to be talking with you about broadband planning, as I think the regional councils have been and will be a key to rolling out broadband in unserved and underserved areas. Because you bring in local resources, you have the trusted knowledge to fill some gaps, and you have the ability to kind of aggregate demand. You know, regional councils are ideally positioned, I think, to convene stakeholders, assess needs, determine gaps, and make a plan to leverage assets, all the elements of a good broadband plan. A regional broadband plan has been used in many areas of the country, like rural South Carolina, the region surrounding the Nez Perce tribe in Idaho, islands in Maine, and more. And we're going to hear about 2 great projects later on in this webinar. But from NTIA's regional and community planning experiences, we found that a well-designed roadmap documents a community's strategic vision and goals and analyzes its resources and needs and guides implementation plan. And we do think that broadband planning is essential to having broadband in communities to spur economic development, increase education and modern health care. It helps with workforce development, inclusion, smart grid, and many more things. And we do feel it's very important as a part of being, for a community and a region to be globally and locally competitive in the 21st century. Amy, next slide.
Great. So we'll just start by giving you a short overview about our agency, NTIA. We're part of the U.S. Department of Commerce, and NTIA is responsible for advising the executive branch on telecommunications and information policy issues. Our major initiatives cover broadband policy and technical assistance through the BroadbandUSA program, which Jean and I are a part of, spectrum policy, and all sorts of internet policies, including digital privacy, Internet of Things, the digital economy, internet governance, policies needed to ensure the global and free flow of information. Also, our agency covers public safety. Some of you may have heard of FirstNet, the First Responder Network Authority, a nationwide public safety broadband network. Next slide. So BroadbandUSA supports community efforts to increase broadband access and digital inclusion in the following ways. We educate state and local leaders and other broadband stakeholders by providing guides and tools and presenting webinars on a variety of broadband topics. We convene key stakeholders such as government entities, industry groups, nonprofits, and advocacy groups and help facilitate conversations amongst these different constituencies. We also offer a technical assistance program to help inform and advise communities on the planning, funding, and implementation of broadband infrastructure and digital inclusion projects. Jean and I actually work directly with a number of communities across the countries on their initiatives. Next slide.
We find overall that broadband access and use have been, critical to the economies and the growth in communities. As you can see from this slide, you see a number of positive impacts of broadband in a community, from healthcare to employment to business values. And what we're finding is additional studies coming out that are also showing the impact of broadband. There's a recent one that came out of, from Purdue University, and they analyzed rural broadband. In that, they found that every dollar invested in rural broadband would return to the state $4 to the economy. It also said that they would have key gains in modern healthcare and education, economic and workforce development, farm income, and consumer savings. There's another recent study by CoBank that found, using telehealth diabetes program, that they had better health outcomes for individuals and incurred savings for the healthcare providers. So I want you to keep this in mind when you talk about what is the vision and what are opportunities and the benefits that might be available by broadband. Next slide. So when you're trying to plan a community broadband roadmap, you start with good questions. It evolves through good data collection, and the result is in broadband projects we hope that meet community needs. We're going to be describing the steps that we put together, Amy and I, in this toolkit on planning for community broadband. And the goal is to include key players and broadband champions and end up with an actionable roadmap for your community and where to go forward in broadband. And I think actionable is the key word, because as you go through, you want to see what projects in what phases you're going to do it, and each project and each implementation area will have its own implementation plan. But the information you collect through this project will keep, and the method of doing it will keep community members engaged, achieve community goals, increase broadband utilization, and continue participation by large institutions and businesses. I might say that, you think you're going to do one plan, but it is an iterative process, as Amy are going to go into soon. But you do want to make sure that you have a constant cycle of evaluation and looking at ways to continually fund and sustain various broadband initiatives. Next slide.
So here are the steps at a high level. We'll go through each one in more detail, but I just wanted to say that working through these steps really help communities develop a full broadband picture. There is an intention behind each of these steps. Each stage plays a different role, and when combined really helps communities think through the different key aspects of any broadband initiative. When possible, communities should try to work through each phase in order building out your plan as you gather more information through each succeeding phase. But as Jean mentioned, we also see that this is often an iterative process. And so the information collected during this process of building the roadmap will help communities be more successful in the end. And really the intention is to plan with the end goal in mind. Next slide. So first off, you'll want to start by assembling a small core team that's initially responsible for developing the vision and goals of your broadband strategy and project. You want to engage different types of stakeholders and look beyond engaging just those with technology expertise. Depending on the purpose of the project, you'll need people with subject matter expertise in topics such as health or education, economic, workforce development, small business, social services. Again, depending on the goals that you have in mind. Note that these people often become some of the most valuable contributors and spokespeople for the project because they understand broadband in the context and overall community goals. The team needs project champions who can talk to and advocate for the vision to the public at large. Next slide.
The second step to take is to assess the resources that your community has and see what gaps are there. And usually this starts by asking questions that will enable your planning team to develop kind of a deeper understanding of what's happening locally. So you might ask, who currently provides broadband, and get a mapping out of who serves residents, businesses, institutions. You know, where are the physical networks or other physical resources that could be used for broadband? You know, is there a middle mile provider? You know, these questions and more are also in the toolkit. But when you answer these questions, you find that by working with your community anchor institutions, the local governments, philanthropic organizations, any major hospital or company, and also broadband providers, it pays to take time to do a deep dive and really find out what they're doing and what their resources are. That's a big first step. The next step is to assess the community needs, and you can do that in a number of ways through workshops, you know, inventorying local resources, conducting specific meetings, doing focus groups, needs assessments, telephone surveys. There's a whole number of ways to pick to go to strategies, but the goal is to involve as many people as possible so that you can, through the process, develop your overall strategy and find what additional resources in your community. And I can say oftentimes you find things that you didn't know about, and it's always very helpful. And you also find potential project partners who will help you with your same goal, with some of your goals. So once you've kind of done your needs analysis, that's when the planners can look at what is the gaps and where the gaps are and what can be done to fill those needs. And by looking at that, you start working with the local leaders and the planning team and start discussing what the path the roadmap should take. Next slide.
Okay. To add on what Jean said, I just want to mention there is also federal data that can help you identify gaps and needs in your community. Both the FCC and the Census has data on broadband availability and broadband adoption that can help you to do that analysis. So after the core team has developed the vision and you've done an initial needs assessment, at that point you'll want to reach out to the stakeholders at large. Again, you'll want to go out and talk with people at the community and really understand broadband in the context of their own community goals. But in order to do this, you need to develop a clear message as to how broadband can help the community. What are the possible community benefits? And be prepared to refine that message. Again, it's an iterative process, so keep checking in with your stakeholders. You may need to have terminology that's understandable beyond the techies. We've seen that some people have used the term high-speed internet instead of broadband in order to make the language more accessible. So this process is important to not only build support for the project, but it can be a way to help identify additional programs and community assets and lay the groundwork for partnerships that will move the projects forward. Next slide.
Fourth, in the planning phase, you start to evaluate the technology and service options that you might need. And this is an important part when you're looking at gaps or you're looking at how to better use what you currently have. And, you know, some of that you can find through existing resources and your own analysis. Some states will have some work on technology, what's available to you. The federal government is starting a program to show where federal assets are that could be used as well. So, you know, there are a number of resources to look at when you say, what are the technology and what are the service decisions? When you say, what is the right technology and service decision, that's something to think about. What is the issue? So if you're saying, hey, I really need to have tourists be able to, you know, have Wi-Fi when they're in the smaller towns, or I needed to end the homework app, then you might look at Wi-Fi. If you're looking at ag, you might say, oh, I might need a combination, including LoRa and white space. You might have wireless, fixed, or mobile. So there's just a whole host of topics you might pick it, as well as last mile and wireless. And through all of this, you're going to have this same series of kind of questions you're going to ask. How much capacity will households, businesses, institutions need in the future? Does it have the right architecture and capacity needs now? Do we need new services? Do we need new capacity? Do we need new equipment? All those kind of questions, and all of it related to how do you meet needs and save costs. I know on digital inclusion, they have a whole other set of programs, which we show here, equipment, where they're located, but I know you're going to have another webinar on that, so I won't dwell on that too much, but it is a key thing to, try to match your technology needs and all the costs related to it. Okay, on to the next one, Amy. Oh, I guess that next one's me. The next one is you're taking a look at what are your organizational models. And, as you look at a project, it is, mostly often done work with a local provider. I might say in rural areas on the horizon is more electric co-ops looking at being broadband providers. But, that's obviously the first, one of the first ways people do. But as you'll see here, there's a whole continuum of ways people have set up projects. For example, on the cooperative line in Georgia, after a regional study done by the university there, two electric co-ops went together to do a broadband co-op. So there's just a whole host of methods that you can go, and it might depend on what your project is. So for example, if you're doing a telehealth project, you might have the hospitals and the other kind of healthcare groups, as well as providers working together within a region to kind of come up with their telehealth method. So you're going to look at all of the different ones that are out there. We do have a toolkit that goes into real detail at some of the examples of how people have set up these projects before. But normally you're going to look at what resource, assets, and funding do you need, and what partnerships you need to meet those things, and what mix you will have within it. So it's just a good thing to remember that, no one size fits all for these projects, because even within your group, you may have phases that need different organizational structures, but the key is to work on what your community needs and what resources you have. So for example, in an area in near Purdue, and they're working with Purdue, the WIN project, they brought 10 communities together to look at how they can look at connectivity, but they're looking at also in terms of, smart rural communities as well as smart agriculture. And I think that, those kind of regional approaches and, taking a very eclectic approach to who is the best partners is a major help as you go forward with this. Okay, next slide.
So with the information gathered in the previous phases and the decisions made, you'll be able to fill out and start your project implementation plans. And these are really the plans that have the administrative, financial, and operational steps of the project that spells these out in more detail. And so the types of things you'll need to specify and really decide at this stage are what specific project activities will take place, look definitely at the funding and how funding will be distributed and shared. I'll make a plug for a webinar that we did last week on federal funding opportunities for broadband. You can access that at our website. Also, a number of states have their own broadband grant project programs out, and there's more in legislation, so it makes sense to keep up to date on what your state is doing around broadband. Also, you'll want to spell out in detail what roles each partner takes. So in addition to the program and project implementation, you'll have to figure out who's going to administer and distribute the funds, who's going to apply for grants or do grant administration, who might do technology support, and then who may, if you have a research and evaluation component, who will do that. So you'll want to figure out how exactly you'll measure and keep track of the status and also measure impact of your projects. How will you know if you need to change or adjust your project midstream? And also, how will you keep up with changes in technology? Next slide.
We just want to mention that, when you're looking at an infrastructure project, you have to look very detailed at the business plan, and they might be in different ways. One, if you're going to implement a project with an existing broadband provider and you just want to streamline the process for them, you might look at streamlining permitting, a map of assets that you have, and you'll look at what your relevant ordinances are relating dig once and how to alert people about construction availability. If you're working with a broadband provider and you're using their services or capacity, you're going to have a lot of issues regarding, and you want to put in reliability and who is responsible when it comes to different kinds of fiduciary relationships. When it comes to a network deployment that you might be doing with a partner, really have to look at doing pro formas that very clearly look at the sustainability of the project, and all of that through with a sensitivity knowledge to see how much flexibility you have for change as you go through. Next slide.
So in summary, some of the best practices that we outline include the fact that you need project champions who are able to advocate for the project, not just in technology terms, but in terms of community and economic benefits. You'll want to stay flexible in terms of timeline and project requirements. Again, the iterative process, so you'll want to be able to adjust. Learn from what other communities and state and regional groups have done. Don't reinvent the wheel. We're here to help at Broadband USA. In addition, about half the states have state broadband offices that provide assistance and guidance as well to local broadband projects. Start the background research and initial planning. A lot of people wait until there's a funding opportunity, but what happens is that sometimes the funding timeline is so fast that they're not able to take advantage. There's sort of a chicken and egg thing going on. You'll really want to start and doing the plan so that you can actually leverage funding and partnership opportunities as they come up. Also engage with organizations who understand the economic and social benefits of broadband so that you can have a broader impact on your community. Again, go beyond just the techies. Jean?
Okay, next slide.
Next slide.
So I think what Amy's done a really good job and throughout this telling you is kind of what we do at Broadband USA. But as you can see, we have a number of resources. I do recommend you go on our website and look at the resources because we have a lot of handouts that can help you in community forums for people to understand it through infographics or short kind of pagers that can help them see what the benefits of broadband can be. We have these extensive toolkits on implementation, building a roadmap, partnerships, all the kinds of things that might help you walk through. And I know I do get occasionally calls from somebody who says, hey, I'm on stage 6. What should I do now? And that kind of gets into our technical assistance program where we can work with you on planning and business case development, different kinds of strategies. So, reach out to Amy or I or generally. I do want to also suggest that you get on our newsletter list because that will kind of give you the latest of what's happening, and we try to put in there all of the latest in the research that's coming out too. So please do contact us at Broadband USA if we can help you make broadband a big part of the economy for the 21st century in your region. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, thank you both so much. We appreciate it. And just for those out there, I did attach the Community Broadband Roadmap Toolkit to the handouts on the right-hand side of your screen. So as Amy and Jean said, it just goes more into detail of each of the steps that they covered and gives you a lot of detail and background and that you can use to build your own broadband roadmap. So with that, we are skipping next to Miriam. Are you there?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Perfect. So I'm Miriam Wiles. I'm the Executive Director of the Southwest Colorado Council of Governments and usually winner of longest title and name. I have a lot of both. So I'm going to go through and give you a quick overview of a little bit of the region, what those challenges were because of our remoteness, and then sort of what we've done, what we've learned in doing this for the last 8 years, and where we're at with that and maybe what you guys can take away from it, hopefully. All right, you can go to the next slide. So this is the area of Southwest Colorado that we work in. It's the little 5 counties. They're highlighted in green. The Four Corners area of the world, if you will. We are really, really remote. We are 350 miles from our state capital. Our closest major metropolitan area is actually Albuquerque, New Mexico. But we're also about 350 miles from Salt Lake City and about the same distance to Phoenix. So we're kind of in the middle of nowhere. I like to say that while we might not be in the middle of nowhere, we can see it. The whole area is about 6,500 square miles. We have 2 reservations. You'll see those 2 colors on the bottom of the map there. Our population is about 101,000, which gives us about 15 people per square mile. We have some real extreme topography with mountains at 14 or 15,000 feet and a lot of canyons as well. And we have very little connectivity. There's almost no middle mile fiber. And the fiber that it does exist is pretty much unusable by local governments or local agencies that are not the incumbent ISP. And we only have 1 route in and 1 route, we have 2 routes, one to the south to Albuquerque and then one north to the next largest city north of us. That is our only 2 routes in and out of the region for fiber. So that creates a few challenges: a lack of fiber, a lack of redundancy, and which makes it also very expensive. So you can change the next slide. So we started the beginning of broadband in Southwest Colorado, or broadband work, is also sort of the beginning of the Southwest COG. We were formed in 2009 and applied for funding to start working on broadband because it was such a need back then. I say back then like it's a long time ago. In technology terms, it sometimes is. We had a real lack of connectivity. We had an extreme lack of affordability. We're talking $10 or more a meg for our local agencies to purchase that, which gets really expensive when you're a small community of 500 or 1,000 people. And then also, like I said, a lack of redundancy. So what we did is we applied for funding from the state of Colorado. At that time, the state of Colorado Department of Local Affairs had a grant application, and we received $3 million and matched it with about $1.25 of local money to start work on broadband. That work was fiber optics development within each community, because $4 million doesn't go real far when you've got 50 plus miles between communities of challenging topography to build middle mile work. So we started on last mile within the communities, and we started building out infrastructure to the community anchor institutions. So we were able to build infrastructure from our city halls to our police departments to our school districts and things like that. And that's known as the Southwest Colorado Access Network, or SCAN. So if I say SCAN, that's what it is. Next slide, please. So the SCAN and planning. So we started this in 2010, and we did a lot of development before we necessarily did a regional plan, which I would not recommend. As you might expect, it creates a few challenges. We got this funding, and instead of going through and putting in a plan to then roll out the funding as part of the funding process, we went through and did a community level plan and put in infrastructure in each community. That doesn't necessarily behoove the region as a whole. Like I said, we connected the community anchor institutions. Most of it is fire department, a few fire departments, our town halls, our road and bridge, various shops, police departments, and some school districts. During this process, we actually learned about a piece of legislation that was put in 2005. And there are 22 states that have similar pieces of legislation. Some are more prohibitive than the one in Colorado. And that is Senate Bill 05-152. And what that did is it limited local government's ability to provide access to local government-owned infrastructure, and limited our ability to provide access in and of itself, like free Wi-Fi in a downtown area. And it prohibited local governments from entering into a public-private partnership. It also prohibits local governments from franchising broadband when it's through a community. We can still franchise cable and telephony, but we can't franchise broadband infrastructure. 152 did have an opt-out clause for that public-private partnership and providing infrastructure or connectivity for our community, and that takes a vote of the population. So each of the communities in the last 5 years have opted out of SB 152 in my region, including the counties. Across the state, it's the vast majority of counties have, the vast majority of communities have, and even a number of school districts have, because the school districts are starting to provide connectivity for some of their low-income or hard-to-reach areas. So, but at the time, SB 152, when it was put in 2005, kind of flew under the radar, and it made it more challenging because now we can't leverage our infrastructure to bring in a revenue stream. We can only build it out to those local governments. Just to give you an example, a strict interpretation of 152 would be the Wi-Fi at your library would be illegal because it is free Wi-Fi. So after opting out of that, we then went through a regional plan of middle mile development. We have this fiber optic networks in each community. Now, it's like, now what? It's like building a road, or building a road to your house, but not connecting it to the highway to get to your property. So in 2015, we went through a comprehensive regional planning process. Next, please. So that leads us, we had 2015 as a regional planning process, it's 2018, so we're not that far away. So what have we done? Where are we now with the regional planning? We have applied from the regional plan. The outcomes were that we need that middle mile network. It doesn't benefit the region if we don't have redundancy, if we don't have access to affordable internet, but we have fiber in each community. So that regional plan has led us to apply for about $15 million from the Rural Healthcare Fund via USAC, which is a program under the FCC. And so we're developing middle mile infrastructure for our hospital and healthcare providers. And in conjunction with that, we're working with our Department of Transportation to put in their own infrastructure, because all we have are state roads out here. The region is so sparsely populated that we only have state roads that link the communities together. We've also been working heavily on the legislation at the state and federal level, specifically at the state of Colorado, and trying to ensure that the legislation that is put in is not more damaging to local governments, but also helps provide more funding for our local partners, our ISPs. And like the folks over, and like Jean and Ian mentioned, the state of Colorado is one of those states that has a broadband office and has a broadband fund. Recently, we just supported some legislation that helped to ensure there was more money in that broadband fund. They moved it over from the telephony to the broadband side, and they're now going from one-year grant cycles with about $9 million to twice-a-year grant cycles with twice that much money in each year for the next 10 years to help offset the cost of building out broadband in rural areas, because it is really expensive and there is no return on investment. We're working on design to go from that middle mile into the communities to help the communities expand their existing fiber. Our funding sources, we're working with the FCC, we are working with our DOT, we're working with our local ISPs to help find funding to put this together. Because everybody knows that broadband is really, really expensive to do, and there's not a lot of resources for middle mile work on a regional basis for local governments. Most of the funding that we have that we put into broadband tends to go to the private sector. And then I have legislation on there twice. Obviously, we do a lot of legislation. Changing the conversation has been one of the major keys to making this work, as well as those partnerships. So when I started 5 years ago at this job, our incumbent CenturyLink basically dominated the conversation about who ran what networks, and everything that we got was going to be good enough because CenturyLink provided it. And it turns out that DSL speeds were not good enough for most of our communities. And so through the course of those 5 years, we've been able to do a lot of education and coordination and communication with our local and state leaders about those challenges of not getting enough service to operate in the modern world. And as a result, that has really changed the conversation in Colorado about how local governments need to be involved in this development as well. Just because it's broadband infrastructure doesn't mean that only the private sector gets to do it. It needs to be a public-private partnership. It needs to be the communities having control over their destiny and their needs. So that conversation has been the foundation of the successes that we've seen in Colorado, with a number of agencies providing high quality service. Like they mentioned, one of our local electric co-ops is providing phenomenal fiber to the home just north of my region. And that's partly because over the last 5 years, this conversation has changed. And then those partnerships go hand in hand with changing the conversation and the regional planning. You've got to have those partnerships or it's going to fail. And those partnerships have to be multi-sector. You have to have economic development. You've got to have the business sector on board. You've got to get the ISPs rallied to understand that this isn't going to necessarily hurt them, actually benefit them if we're trying to build out infrastructure that they can use. Or to engage with them to figure out where to build the best infrastructure if they're applying for funding. Those partnerships also are local governments, our healthcare providers, our first responders. And recently, what's come up is actually our bar association has been wanting to understand why broadband is important for access to justice. So it crosses so many sectors, and there's been so much engagement across those sectors to help with those partnerships in that conversation, and pushing our state and local elected officials to ensure that there is funding and there is planning and development and things like that when it comes to broadband. Next slide, please. So there are a lot of challenges about building out broadband, as I'm sure pretty much everybody has figured out by now. There's that education component. It is really scary. Those elected officials, your commissioners and your mayors, are not experts in broadband. They rely on their IT folks. They are kind of scared by a lot of the technology terms and tend to shy away from it. So changing the conversation from the technical aspect to a more human-centered aspect really helps that buy-in. Working with the incumbents to help with that education piece, working with your incumbents, if at all possible, to help with the broadband planning also helps. You also may have an incumbent, depending upon your area, that is not willing to participate, and that becomes a challenge. Those laws, like I said, 22 states have that. And then really, broadband is super expensive, and it comes down to it's hard to come up with enough money to do that. To put in middle mile infrastructure in Southwest Colorado will cost us at least $74 million. It's hard to find $74 million or even $10 million sometimes. So that's what I mean by money. And be creative when it comes to your financing. What do those public-private partnerships look like? You can go ahead, change. Next slide, please.
I did. It's just taking a while. I apologize.
Okay. No worries. There we go. So I wanted to show you some of the challenges that we do have. And these are maps that I've pulled from the FCC. The FCC gathers all the information that is self-reported by the ISPs. And that's a whole other conversation about the self-reported, but I'm just going to show you the maps of what it looks like with the various of connectivity in this area. So you can kind of see Durango in the middle of that map right there. And the darker the color, the more providers there are. So keep in mind that there's also only ever one cable provider for each community. So there's one cable provider in some of the communities, but other communities don't even have cable providers to provide connectivity. And we're up here, the 25 by -3 is the technical speed for broadband. So we're looking at broadband speeds in Southwest Colorado by carrier, or excuse me, by type. So there's a variety of types. So this is your cable internet. In the next slide, when it decides to come.
Don't know why these are taking so long. Sorry about that.
Oh, that's all right. Technology is super useful.
This is why we need great broadband everywhere.
Exactly.
Okay. Let me try one more time.
There we go. And then DSL is your landline, is your internet over your copper. And DSL is challenged to get to 25 by 3, the definition of broadband. As you can see, I'm going to also highlight that this is self-reported, and there are some areas that are reported on here that do not have 25 by 3 on an operational basis, especially in that far southwest corner of the map, because that's a reservation, and the reservations typically are very impacted by low broadband. The next slide, please. And here's your residential fiber map. So I have no residential fiber in southwest Colorado, as you can see. Telluride is slightly outside my region, and actually Telluride is special because there's a couple of communities up there that, or a couple of neighborhoods that put in their own broadband, or their own fiber, because they were getting such bad service. So you can go to the next slide. And then this is for fixed wireless, your wireless providers. Also, we have no wireless provider that can provide broadband speeds on a consistent basis that's self-reported. We do have a number of wireless providers, but they don't necessarily provide that 25 by 3 megabits per second up and down. So next slide. So you can see those challenges that we have. We just have such a lack of connectivity that it impacts our businesses, our education, our, just consumption across the board. Our successes have been in a more, we've had a lot of successes. They haven't necessarily been because we have a ton of fiber in the ground now, but those successes have laid the groundwork for us to be able to do so. And that's, we have education. Our elected officials, my board is very technology savvy, even if they don't think they are. They understand the tech terms, megabits per second, gigabits per second, that type of stuff. We've finally overcome a lot of hurdles of buy-in with some of our ISPs where they understand that we're working in collaboration and not against them. And that's taken a few years to overcome, but we really do have great communication and collaboration with them. We've gotten a number of pieces of legislation passed and a bunch that not passed or not even introduced because it was challenging. So all of that has really shifted the conversation here in Colorado, and especially in Southwest Colorado, to really find those solutions. And we found our niche. Instead of working on broadband in each community as a cog, which is kind of challenging with that jurisdictional overlap and oversteps at times, that middle mile work has really been a much better spot for us to be, because we are then working across jurisdictional boundaries and not overstepping our bounds. Colorado is very strong in local control. We don't like our overstepping of boundaries. And then we're working on funding. And I say question mark because we won't find out from Universal Service Corporation Administration, USAC, until January, maybe even up to March, if we have received funding for our healthcare project. So hopefully we will do that, and I'll be able to share some even more cool things that we're doing later. Next slide. And I think that's about it when it comes to what we're doing here. Again, Southwest Colorado is incredibly rural, and so some of our challenges are a little bit more acute than some of the other communities or regions that you'll work with, but they are all the same. It's all the same. It's just how acute are the topography versus population and things like that. I'm happy to talk more about some of the things that we've done and what we've worked on. Give me a holler, and you'll all have my information anyway. So thanks.
All right, thank you, Miriam, so much. All right, and lastly, we will hear from Kevin. Are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Excellent to hear from our partners at BroadbandUSA and seeing the resources they put together, because I think in hindsight, we've gone through a lot of the processes they laid out. So it's an excellent roadmap. And then Miriam, we are in similar positions that you are experiencing with your broadband deployment, and not only similar in where we are within our states geographically, but I think with our projects. So we are in Southwest Virginia. On the slide that you see there, we're that green area. And Virginia Tech is in our region. That often puts us on the map in terms of the town of Blacksburg. As a little factoid for you, we are closer to 7 other state capitals than our own. And if you go to far southwest Virginia, many of them are closer to 9 other state capitals. So that, as a result, has helped us work together on a lot of things, and regional collaboration has been a mainstay for us. Next slide. So there's a lot of things you can do without planning. You can jump right in, but I think that broadband deployment is one of those that you really have to have a good handle on what you're getting yourself into and what your top strategies or priorities are before you start putting money into projects. In 2004, our organization helped convene the region for the first broadband plan, and then in 2006, we essentially wrapped it up. It included a really robust fiber network that had middle mile aspirations, as well as fiber to every nook, cranny, and holler that we could get it to. Reality sets in, and costs are what they are, and so we've been just taking little bites at that apple as we go along. So the state funded the first broadband study for us, and then we are looking to update that again in the coming calendar year. Our update is going to really be focused on vertical assets and some unique deployment strategies that might be more effective in our area. And this is important not just for urbanized areas, but also our rural areas when you're looking at vertical assets. Some of our most populated areas, they're water tanks that they have attachment agreements on. They're fully subscribed with national incumbents and local internet service providers. So they're trying to figure out how do we create more capacity and whether or not we need to build emergency service towers to be able to co-locate. But vertical assets are becoming a really important feature with any of the broadband deployments. And we certainly realize that fiber to the home is the gold standard, but we also recognize that the ROI is not there in a lot of these rural communities. Another piece of the vertical asset work that we're getting ready to get into is trying to standardize some agreements across our communities, and that we have different tiers of pricing for attachments for the national providers in contrast to our more local internet service providers, and trying to create some competition in the marketplace by having those attachment agreements show or reflect really what the companies are willing and able to pay. Next slide. So our role in implementation, in Virginia, our General Assembly enables what's called authorities, which are really joint exercise of powers in certain areas. So a lot of our communities have authorities set up to jointly own infrastructure like water and sewer. About 15 years ago, Virginia enabled broadband authorities to be established. So we put together one in our region, and they're voluntary by the local governments that saw a need to invest. So we had 2 counties in an independent city initially establish the broadband authority, and our staff really provided the day-to-day operations of that entity. That was created so we could then go pursue grant funds. We made an initial application to the U.S. Economic Development Administration, the EDA, and that was before the recession. We were offered funds around $1 million to do a project, and we needed to come up with 50% match. And we could not find that match locally, so ultimately the project died on the vine. Then when Stimulus Act fund came around, we were able to pursue an application that had an 80-20 match scenario, which is a lot more favorable. And under the EDA application and our first Stimulus Act application, the authority was in the first position, and then the local governments were kind of a secondary role. Then we moved into the stimulus application. We had a local cooperative called Citizens Cooperative out of Floyd County, Virginia, that was going to be maintaining the fiber, but the intent was that the authority would own and operate the fiber. Well, that project was reviewed and then denied, and they suggested that we flip our model to where the cooperative be the applicant and the authority provide the financial match and just really be a supporting role, because the cooperative had the experience of owning, operating, and maintaining fiber network. So we quickly turned around the application, and we were successful with the $11.2 million grant fund to run 200 miles of middle mile fiber. And we have the state broadband program in Virginia, and it sounds like Colorado is a little bit more invested in Virginia. The past several years, we've had $1 million statewide, and then this past year, the General Assembly increased it to $4 million. But they do have a really good program design, so I'd encourage you to look at that program design if you're interested in the Virginia Telecommunications Initiative. Next slide. So I mentioned we had a 200-mile, middle-mile open access fiber project. Since it had a federal investment, it needed to be open access, and that is maintained by Citizens Cooperative out of Floyd, Virginia. And for that project, we served as the fiscal agent in making the application, and we conducted the environmental assessment over 200 miles, which is pretty arduous. And then while the project was getting built, we were working with the cooperative and the Broadband Authority to figure out what the rate structure would look like. We had all of the anchor institutions covered within that 200 miles, which went outside of our region on both sides along Interstate 81. And we had 3 different tiers, essentially, of rates. Those that were in the authority and provided the initial match, those that came and joined the authority after the grant funds were announced, and then a 3rd tier of those that were receiving the service at anchor institutions but were not members of the authority. Still a very preferential rate structure. But you know, our role has been really to help provide that nexus between the provider of the internet or the broadband service and the local governments. Next slide. So what are we doing absent a construction project? We are still really busy in this space, and I heard Miriam talk about educating, and we do a whole lot of that. It was just a few years ago that it wasn't really on everybody's radar. Now it's a part of every campaign locally and state level about we need higher speeds, and the businesses locally are frustrated, but we're there to educate as to why we don't have the best speeds in the world. A lot of it is ROI in rural communities. So we often are educating them and saying the local government role isn't necessarily to own and operate the infrastructure, because we've seen some limitations on that and some stories that are not very successful. It's mostly about lowering the barriers of entry to any provider, whether local or national providers. You know, the dig once policies are heard about, having those, whether it's vertical asset attachment agreements, those sort of things, but doing whatever we can to lower the barrier of entry so it decreases their overhead costs in operating. Also understanding that government subsidy is going to be really important as you look at not just this infrastructure, but all infrastructure. There's a subsidy involved, and I think that we're having to recognize that here locally. Community assessments. We've been doing some voluntary survey work in a few of our communities where we asked for the user experience. So they would take a speed test, give us the data. They would give us address information, not the mailing address specifically, but a street name. And we were able to ascertain what those speeds were in those communities. And then we'd also asking them to respond about 4 different factors of their broadband experience, whether it was reliability, support services, speed, those sort of things. And basically, we took all this information, collected over about a 6-month period of time, educated all the elected officials with it, and then we called together all the internet service providers. We have 13 different ones within our geography, and provided this information to them and said, we really need you to do more. In community A, these are the issues we observed. Community B, C, they were all different issues, primarily because of speed. And that really helped challenge them, but we haven't seen many people step up. And that's where we are now, is trying to encourage and make applications for funding that'll help those providers do more. We've been taking as many best practices across the country. We see a lot of these in case studies and sharing those out, but then there are some that the state is invested in that are great rural models that haven't had case studies prepared. So we've been documenting some of those and submitting them along with grant applications. And, you know, we're always looking for the implementation funding. As I mentioned, Virginia just increased their investment, and I think we've got some really good projects to move forward, but we're missing some of the really big pots of funds that I think are going to attract our national incumbents to do more. I think that's about it from me in the New River Valley. I'd be happy to take any questions.
All right, thank you so much, Kevin. Appreciate it. So with that, we have a few minutes left, so I am going to take a few of the questions that are coming in. Let's see, this first one says, what have you found to be the most comprehensive sources for identifying where the infrastructure already exists to avoid duplication of efforts? Have you found accurate maps? We have found that many maps show a larger service area than what actually exists because of the definition of coverage providers have available. So maybe that's more geared towards Miriam and Kevin, but maybe Amy and Jean can help as well.
I can take that. This is Miriam. We've actually found that the local ISPs are typically willing to share their maps when working with them because they understand they don't want to be overbuilt, but the large national incumbents will not share maps because they claim it's public safety. So that's we have run into that challenge as well, and I don't know if there is a holistic solution to it.
I might mention
yeah,
also
we've seen
that,
the same thing. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Kevin.
Yeah, we've seen the same thing about access to information. Then we pull them together and try to get information about specific project areas, and that seems to be a little bit more successful. The issue about census tracts and coverage is something that we take to the Hill a lot of times, particularly trying to influence the Farm Bill on that, is that when one census tract, one mailbox is served in the census tract, in particularly rural areas, these census tracts can be enormous. That doesn't mean that everybody has coverage. So we're really trying to educate on that one too.
I should say that NTIA got a little money to see if they can do some improvements on the 477 data, which we're working on, which is to try to get additional resources from companies to provide mapping data, and we're going through that process. So I think that's something that's probably be a several-year process, but I think you've hit it. One of the things that California has done is they've kind of allowed citizen science to come in, which is for their broadband grant program, if you can show by a speed test, which they make available, and if you could show that there is not service in your area, then they will make it available for you to do grants through them. So, it can vary state by state, but I think this is an issue of trying to get the best data so you can really see where the gaps are. Amy, do you want to add anything to that?
You covered it.
Okay. But yeah, I would look at some states.
I was going to say our state legislation just changed our broadband fund because that came up with the local providers saying, complaining about the incumbent with the census block issues. And so I'll look up what that language is from the state of Colorado, and I can send it out to Macy, and she can send it to everybody.
Definitely. Cool. Thank you all. Just as a quick reminder, for those who may have missed this at the beginning, the PowerPoint presentation is available now to download in the handouts on the right-hand side of your screen, and a recording of this webinar will also be available on our NARC YouTube page. I'll put it up probably within the next hour, but we'll also send out the link tomorrow in a follow-up email to everybody who registered. So feel free to pass both of those resources around, along with the community broadband map from BroadbandUSA that's also in the handouts. The more we can get the word out, the better. So I don't see any questions here left, but as you can see on the screen, all of our contact information is there. So if you think of something later that pertains to any of the presentations, or just have a general question, feel free to shout out to any of us. I'm sure we'll all be happy to help. But with that, Just want to thank you all. Thank you so much to our speakers who joined us today. We really appreciate it and love to hear your stories and your resources that you have and how, helpful it is to your peers in the regional community space. And we have a couple more webinars coming up. We're having another one in partnership with Broadband USA next month that focuses on regional digital inclusion. That'll be on November 13th at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. And then for those who are interested in more broadly economic development issues, we're having a webinar on opportunity zones. It's that same week, but it'll be on that Thursday, November 15th at the same time, 3 p.m. Eastern Time. So with that, thank you all so much for joining us, and I hope you have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.